Okay, welcome everybody. I'm so excited to be having an incredible dialogue today on mergers, strategic alliances. We know this is something that's been on people's minds, but we don't know exactly what you're thinking about. We've assembled a fantastic crew for you. They're panelists, but let's think of them as the crew because it's more fun. And everybody's doing Zoom webinars these days, and they're going to be able to answer your questions and let you know what they're thinking. So please, if you're watching this live, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A at any time, and we'll make sure we get around to them. If you can't find it, you can put them in the chat, but it's easier if you put them in the Q&A for us to keep track. If you're watching the recording, I welcome for you to put your questions in the comments, and we'll do our best to get back to you. And let's start off with a few introductions so you know who's in the room. I'm Sarah Olivieri. I'm going to be your host today. I'm sure I'll have some opinions too. I'm a nonprofit business consultant, international best-selling author, and creator of the Impact Method. And I'm going to have each of our specialists introduce themselves with who they are and a few tidbits about what they are experts at and what they love doing. And Mary, who's my co-host, will you start us off?
Sure. Thanks, Sarah. I'm just thrilled to be here with everyone. I'm Mary Hiland, and I'm on the West Coast in the Bay Area, and I have been a consultant for 18 years. Before that, an executive director. And I work and specialize with working with boards and helping executives really have a powerful strategic partnership with their boards. And in that work, I just want to mention, people want to reach out to me later. I have myself personally led 2 nonprofit mergers, and I've consulted with about 70 nonprofits going through this process at some level or exploring partners or whatever it is. So I know everyone here has experience, and I want to just let you know if something comes up we don't have time for, feel free to reach out to me anytime. So I'm thrilled that you're here. I love this topic. It's very close to my heart.
Fantastic. Thanks, Mary. Matt, will you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Matt Hugg. I run a website called nonprofit.courses. And we have more than 1,000 videos and podcasts, including a handful from the folks here today. My background is in charitable gift fundraising since a long time, working with universities and then consulting to all sorts of nonprofits since 2005. I also teach fundraising and philanthropy and marketing, and have a couple books out as well.
Fantastic. Thanks, Matt. Gregory?
Sure. Nice to be here. It's a pleasure to love one of my favorite topics to be discussing. My name is Greg Nielsen. I am an attorney by background, practiced law for a number of years before I became a nonprofit CEO. Served as a nonprofit CEO for a little over a decade, and now have my own consulting company where I work with nonprofits around the country, primarily in board excellence, similar to Mary, strategic planning and organizational development, including sustained collaboration and merger. Also, as Matt mentioned, host a podcast called Nonprofit Vision.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Mike?
Mike Burns. I'm out of New Haven, Connecticut. I am partner in a firm called BWB Solutions. My work tends to focus on the internal challenges that boards and execs face primarily with each other. Done a bit of research on board chairs along with Mary. And my merger work has mostly involved assessing readiness on the part of one or more, and then also looking for the matches and finding a good match for the folks that are looking.
Fantastic. Well, we've already identified a few themes because we've been running a survey around what people are thinking about. And so I'll kind of guide us through those, but at any time, feel free to ask your questions. And Mike, since you brought up a question, I'm going to start with this issue that some people have shared is they're interested in a merger or a strategic alliance, but they don't know where to start or who to merge with. Who would like to start this conversation around how do you find somebody to merge with or form an alliance with?
For me, mission is everything, and so I start with mission and making sure that that the rationale for thinking merger is an answer to whatever the the typical consultant question, which is what's the problem we're trying to solve, and starting there and looking at mission and looking at what limits the ability to necessarily, if at all, limits the ability to go forward on their own, and or would enhance the ability to go forward on their own. We'll get around to matches.
What crosses my mind is why merge to begin with. It's not a way of bailing yourself out. People, mergers tend not to work out well when one of the partners is really in trouble. First, it's hard to attract anybody. But yeah, mission is it, but not to be too, I would say not, I don't want to say tied to your mission, but focus on mission as opposed to, like I know two organizations that were going to merge, but the one came from one cultural background, the other one came from another cultural background, and that got in the way, but the mission was nearly the same.
Yeah. And how did, Mary, go ahead.
I think that when you're looking for a partner, I mean, assuming I agree with Mike and Matt that mission is the most important, you want to look at compatible mission, but you also want to look, merger and alliances are a strategy. They are not an end in themselves. And they're not a rescue strategy, as Matt said, for sure. But when you're looking for a partner, you need to think ahead of time. What are our criteria? What is really important to us? And that maybe I worked with a nonprofit, for example, who had a certain geographic area that was very, very important, underserved community. They wanted evidence that any partner would be committed to that community. So that's just one little puny example, but you need to agree on what are our criteria. And I don't say deal breakers because frankly, mission can help you overcome deal breakers. So don't create a lot of obstacles out the gate, but figure out what's important to you at your core.
Yeah, so I'm really hearing finding someone who has an aligned mission to yours. Gregory, did you just need to add?
Yeah, Sarah, there's a phrase I use with my clients. It's, prescription without diagnosis is malpractice, right? And so I think anytime we're talking about collaboration between two organizations, and merger is on one far end of the spectrum, it's important for both organizations to do that deep dive, take the time to do the due diligence, to understand what challenges are we trying to address, what what is missing from our organization, or what is it that we are looking for a complement for what we do, whether it's geography, whether it's funding sources, whether it's board leadership, whatever that complementary piece is, let's identify it at the outset, because as Mary mentioned, mergers is a strategy. It's a tool. It's not an end in and of itself.
And Greg, that brings to my mind the situations I've heard of, and I actually have seen this, where in business, for example, there's a propensity to merge when the leadership is aging out. And I've seen it happen in nonprofits where a leader is retiring, and then this merger discussion kind of starts percolating up. And I think it took a bit for them to figure out that that's what was driving it, even though they wanted to think it was bigger, more higher things than that. And so the analysis is really important.
At the same time, it is an opportunity. Retirement or even death. I've had one client who the board reached out, and the exec, who was a founder exec, died, and the board wasn't really much of a board before, and they were even less of a board afterwards, and they just said, we need to do something different. And so we found a partner for them, and that worked out fine. But retirement, death, I'm not that concerned, but it makes a lot easier marriage when there's not an heir apparent, or you have to fight over an heir apparent.
Yeah.
I think the ultimate question is, are we better together? Are we better together? That's what it's all about.
Yeah. So in finding a potential, if you've decided a merger is right, you could reach out to some consultants to see if they can help you find somebody. I heard Mike saying that. I want to touch on something, Greg, you said a merger is like one end, and I'd love to talk a little bit about, so we have the full picture here, because I am like a master of strategic alliances and much less formal joint venture type activities. And so I just want to bring those to the table before we keep going on our other issues. I'd love the other consultants or those people watching, if you have some examples on the opposite end, what can a successful, even very informal partnership look like and do for you as an organization?
I appreciate you saying that. I did caution on the merger that it's one end of a spectrum. And I think sometimes when we enter a conversation with that word merger, which tends to be a really loaded term, a really big term for boards to consider, sometimes it can look like, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? And when we're looking for merger, we can talk ourselves into it, when in reality, as you mentioned, Sarah, there's a whole range of opportunities out there, from, simple cooperation, meaning these are two organizations that weren't previously aware of one another, weren't previously in dialogue and communication, but are now speaking more openly with one another, to sustained collaboration, to strategic alignments where we're going to partner on a particular program. There's a real menu of options that are out there. And as Mary said, it's about figuring out, how do we work well together? What challenges can we address that are better addressed together than they are separate? And then let's look for a solution that's somewhere along that continuum. And it may end up in merger, but it may be that we're better served in a strategic alignment or in a simple letter agreement collaboration.
Well, and Greg, I see that Gary posed a question about how do you discover what why is, and why really will lead to whatever that solution is. If you're, I would think, if you just can't accomplish something that's in your mission, that you need more resources, or that somebody brings some sort of tool to it, that speaks not to merger, but to partnership, or whatever that is.
One benefit of merger or a strategic alliance, particularly merger, but any kind of formal arrangement, it could be a joint venture, to your point, Sarah. I think as you go down the continuum, you get more formal, you need more formal agreements. It's a lot more work. It does cost to pull these things off. But I think that one thing about the why is a couple. One, it should stem from your strategic planning in the first place. You should be looking about, what are our strategic priorities? How are we going to advance our mission? One of the important things that smaller nonprofits, I don't think about enough, is how are we going to build our infrastructure? This can be a fabulous strategy for building that infrastructure. When you're the executive director and you're doing the development, you're doing the finance, you're the program director, you're everything, it takes a big boost of money for you and your board to hire in that bench, that team under you. And if you can partner and get that team, that can be so powerful for you. So I just want to mention it, because it's a very important why, and don't miss it.
Well, Mary,
that's so hard to do.
Here in Pennsylvania for a long time, the Pennsylvania Association of Nonprofit Organizations, PANO, modeled a shared services agreement with 2 or 3 other nonprofits, where they shared database portions of a database and accounting and all these people, and had a common staff between them. And it really worked well, just for that, what you're talking about. Yeah.
So there can be a back office, Sarah, to your question, a kind of back office arrangement where you're actually merging some of your administration, not necessarily program.
That's
so
great examples. I know 2 nonprofits who formed a very informal joint venture partnership to do Giving Tuesday together. They had both flopped in the past, and they're like, let's just do it together. And they ran a fantastic campaign, and they both raised way more money than they had ever done before individually. And they had a lot more fun doing it. And that was the extent of the whole partnership. But that was just one focused campaign that they came together on to do together. And it was a huge
Well, we
success.
tend to think about mergers or these joint ventures as being similarly missioned organizations. But, you know, in that case, I would imagine that having complementary, not competitor missions would really be helpful.
Absolutely. And I can say, you know, on the joint venture, what, you know, while what makes a merger probably successful is two organizations who are maybe more similar than they are different, joint ventures are kind of the opposite end. You want to look for different but complementary. So maybe you serve the same people but in different ways. Or maybe, you know, there's a lot of kind of piggybacking or things that go well together. We're getting some questions around the hows and the whys, and I want to tie this into one of our other, one of the other points that came up is how do you make it a win-win? In the surveys we did, we got a lot of questions and concerns about there being an imbalance of power or competition for donors or who's going to make the decisions or are we going to lose everything that we're about? How do you make this the how, right, of the win-win?
Well, if it's mission first, it can be win-win. When we did one of our mergers, our story, I'll tell you, 4 executive directors and I sat in a room twice a month for a year. And all we did was focus on structure. What is this going to look like? Big mistake. Structure comes way down the line. We got a facilitator, which frankly, research into this alliance and collaboration, I'm not marketing here, but really you need a third party. And that's the other thing that can help you have a win-win. You get somebody who's looking out for both of you or all 3 of you or however many there are in the deal. But as soon as we got kind of knocked upside the head and said, what are you trying to create together? What are the opportunities? What do you envision that would be exciting if you pulled resources? We got so excited that we went, like in 3 months, we were at our boards with a resolution. The vision was so powerful. And that's what creates the win-win, because what can happen if you've made good choice and you're all focused on the mission and you know what you're creating together, the obstacles, you work it out. You have to be motivated to work it out. Don't lead with obstacles, lead with opportunity and excitement.
I love that you said that. Go ahead.
Greg, do you want to?
Sure. There's a word we haven't mentioned yet that I think is really important in any of these discussions, and it's culture. You know, it's the having a sense of what is our organizational culture, what are our non-negotiables that constitutes who we are, our organizational values. What is the culture of this other organization that we are looking to have a relationship of some type with? And I think the more intentional organizations are at the outset of the process about identifying their own organizational culture, talking to their staff, talking to their board about what that culture is and how does it mesh with this potential partner. I think that that's a way to set a conversation up for success. A lot of times we can get really jazzed up about the programs and we can get really excited about, you know, the financials and the opportunities for fundraising, but we need to pause for a minute and understand what is it about our culture, what is it about their culture, and how well are they going to mesh together, and what do we need to do to preserve that. And similar, because it addresses your question, Sarah, is how do we manage the fear of change? You know, in any partnership, in any collaboration, there's going to be a sense of fear and a reluctance to change among at least some segment of the organization. The more we can be intentional about acknowledging that at the outset and putting in place specific approaches that can understand that change and bring people along with us, I think we set ourselves up for a better outcome.
I think there are 2 other words we haven't used. One which is often one that we hide behind the corners, which is acquisitions. And then partnering that with scale. I think in today's market, scale really matters, that little bitty nonprofits, and I mean less than $1 million, are struggling. And it's not going to get prettier, and not to be the the bearer of bad news. But if you don't know that news, then I would ask you to rethink. But in the moment, scale matters, and getting all the resources you can possibly get to do mission matters. And sometimes the best partnership is actually an acquisition, where someone who has scale and or would have more scale if they were to take you under their wing, for a nice way to put it, doesn't mean necessarily losing identity, it definitely does not mean losing mission, but makes different jobs for different folks. And so I am a promoter of acquisition. I think it's too hard to survive without scale in today's market.
And so far as the donors are concerned, I find it fascinating that they always positively surprise me. That if you talk to a donor and say that you're considering whatever this is, anything short of a merger, right? Mm-hmm. That they will largely be positive about it if you have done your work ahead of time to engage with them and bring them on as partners in your organization. Anyhow, they should see the value of what you're doing. And now, if you both have the same donor, then that's all the better, because they're seeing their money getting more use than just going to one or the other of you. So don't sell them short. And don't sell yourself short. It's not necessarily going to be a win-lose with the other organization. There can be a lot of upside to that.
Yeah, I'd love to touch on two things that people have been afraid that they might lose. Donors, which you've touched on. Does anybody else want to say anything else about donors? And my other question is then going to be about people losing their jobs.
I mean, I'll defer to Greg, but there are legal concerns or questions that will have to be answered from a donor perspective, particularly in a merger and acquisition. They will have to be answered. Sometimes it takes a long time to get to the answer. Finding donors, finding restricted money donors in particular. I mean, those questions will need to be answered. They are a hassle. They are not the problem of the boards that are working on this, but they will be a challenge, and they may take a little more time.
I hate to keep harping on this, but it comes back to mission. Your donors invest in you because of what you're bringing to the community, and hopefully, and you need to be able to be the evangelist of this exciting vision for how things are going to be even better in your partnership. And that's what you do with donors anyway. So you shouldn't, in our merger, we were talking about 4 nonprofits, basically, with 2 coming together, 2 mergers coming together. We only lost 1 donor. And the reason we lost the donor had nothing to do with the mission. It had to do with offering. There were 3 executive directors competing for the job, had to do with offering a severance package to the executives who didn't get the job, and 1 donor was outraged. You don't do that in nonprofits, which is totally ridiculous. Of course you do. But anyway, we became a big organization, and there were a lot of donors, and nobody lost except for that 1. So I think it's frankly a misplaced fear. If you're doing this right and you're focusing on mission, you will find donors who get very excited about this. And while I'm talking, I'll just address the other thing, Sarah, about losing staff.
Mary, before you go,
Sure.
Remember, they're not your donors, they're the donors to your mission.
Yes.
And that's huge.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Nonprofit mergers. Now, this is all up in the air in the pandemic, folks. And to Mike's point, smaller nonprofits are struggling, and a lot of nonprofits have lost significant funding. So this is a new world. So you have to, just take that into consideration. But at least in the past, mergers are not like nonprofit mergers are not like for-profit mergers. They don't come together to cut staff and cut program. They come to build them. And typically there aren't, it's not a big layoff strategy. We brought together over 500 employees And there was only one position that we eliminated, and we were able to create an option. The person chose not to take it, but we didn't lose anybody. And I think that this is something that, as you think about why you're doing it, if you're doing it to grow and strengthen program, you're not necessarily going to lose anybody.
Yeah, I just want to kind of piggyback on that. What Mary just said is a lot of nonprofits who come to me are understaffed already. So it's highly unlikely that in a merger situation, they might finally be adequately staffed. They're not likely to be cut. They don't have a lot of extra going on. So I think that for many organizations is a misplaced.
Not that you wouldn't lose already. I mean, if you're cutting back and you're losing money, you're going to lose staff, not because of coming together with another organization.
Yeah, great. We have some more specific questions. One person in particular, Mary, asked, can you talk a little more about the continuum of partnership? And maybe we can use this to kind of extend, like, what does it really look like to be merged? If it's not just a static thing, what is this process? What is this continuum?
Well, I do want to give you all a reference, because this continuum really was created by David LaPiana, and he wrote a book about it. And you can reach out to me later. The title eludes me. It was quite a while ago, but there was a continuum of strategic things. On the merger end, you're talking about corporate integration. You're talking about creating one corporation where there were more than one. And there's lots of, I mean, Gregory, you're probably the expert on this, but there's lots of different configurations on that. In our two that we did, one was what Mike was talking about. You don't use acquisition language typically in the nonprofit sector, although we all know that's what we're talking about, because nobody owns your nonprofit. You're not buying somebody's stock, but you are getting all their assets. So in one case, we did an asset sale where the other nonprofit sold all their assets to us for $1. We did that kind of a legal document, and they had nothing. And then after a year for creating a firewall for liability, they dissolved their corporation. But we took over the staff, we took over the programs, we took over the funding, and that was an asset acquisition. In the other one, we had 3 corporations. We picked the one with the most licenses because we didn't want to redo all that work, and we dissolved the other 2. So and you need an attorney, but you don't get an attorney at the beginning. No offense, Greg. If you start working with the attorney up front, you're going to spend a lot of money, and you can negotiate everything with a good facilitator and create your term sheet. But other things are what Sarah was talking about. You can do a back office contract arrangement. You can do, I've seen people do membership. They're the sole member. I'm not very good at this technicality, but sole member of an umbrella corporation. Lots of options legally, but the main thing is decide what you want to create, and then someone can help you figure out the best structure for it.
I love the example. Can someone else give us an example, a real life example of what kind of form the merger took or partnership took?
Well, so one which I'll go back to an acquisition and recognizing that that's not the perfect language, but it represents. Now, in this case, they did have restricted gifts, and they had, more importantly, a reputation, an identity, and a mission that needed to be preserved. And the board that didn't actually want to be board anymore said, we'll get out of this, but we need you to make sure that in the agreement of who we're going to be next, as part of you, that you actually find use of the name, of the brand, and that you make sure that our donors, both the donors that are annual and the donors who have given quasi-endowment gifts, that those are preserved and used for the mission purposes. And So the big step was actually talking to the two boards and getting them clear of what the conversation was going to be about. They talked individually that there was interest, and then they talked together in a committee. Then they talked collectively. I mean, yes, there was a lot of process. It's good money for a facilitator. And by the way, just as an aside, to Mary's point about when to bring in the lawyer, that wasn't the time for the lawyer, but I sometimes am amused that doing this with bylaws, for instance, bringing in a lawyer for bylaws first is going to take you a lot more time than figuring out what you want as rules and then bringing your lawyer to make sure it's legal. But I think that's the same kind of message in mergers or acquisitions or partnerships or joint ventures, is that, you know, figure out what you want as the end game. And in this case, the acquisition took a year. There were details to be worked out in terms of, you know, the assets and the donors and making sure the messaging was clear. And in the end of the year, it still wasn't complete. We still had a board member that transferred over to the acquisition board, even despite their desire not to be a board. And then they started the work of actually promoting the organization within the new organization, or within the acquiring organization.
Yeah.
Sarah, I would add to what Mike was just saying in terms of the process and getting to the how. Is I think it's really important to be clear on roles in the process, in the discussion. So I think the mergers that I've been a part of that have been the most successful have been really intentional, and there's that word again, about whose role, you know, who is going to assume what role through the process. What is going to be the role of the executive director in the process? What is going to be the role of the board? You know, and in most of the organizations that I've been a part of, the chief executive throughout the merger discussions is really a chief relationship officer, is the one that's bridging that gap, leading the conversations to provide the best information, the best intelligence to the boards so that they can ultimately make decisions that are in the long-term best interest of the organization. But I think it's really clear to assign roles at the outset and to be clear on lines and limits of authority as well.
And you know, Greg, you bring up roles. I think of one group that comes to mind, or actually it was two groups, or social service organizations, and they were able to figure out what people's strengths and skills were. So the person who headed one organization, who was a social worker, became the chief operating officer. The other person who was headed the other organization, it came from a business background, became the CEO. And they really worked very well in tandem with each other. They both reported to the board. I don't know that was the best thing they could have done, but but it was a nice partnership and got that organization through that transition period using both their strengths, because each was respected by the staff for their specific skills.
There's some questions around, and this was a concern that came up in the survey responses as well, around how do we make sure we don't lose our excellent programming or the quality of our programming? And there's some questions here about that. How do we continue to deliver excellent service? So can someone address that concern or share some examples around that?
I think that this is something that I hate to say this, sounds so simple, but you really work it out together. You don't want to lose your assets, whether those are quality programs, resources, donors. You don't have to. This isn't a lose-lose proposition. Again, it's a win-win if you do it right. I think that the whole issue of how you're coming together, ways that we did it is we got staff in very similar programs together, and we spent time. It took a couple of months to talk about what is your theory of change? Why do you do things the way you do them? What are the things that you feel are critical to your success with clients versus just, okay, we're just all going to occupy the same building and do the same thing. It doesn't work like that. Gregory mentioned culture. This is where the rubber hits the road, is when you're bringing people together. It's about making how you do things and why you do them very explicit. And then working together to value the best of both or 3 or however many you're coming together and bringing together.
Yeah, I want to second
yeah.
that the theory of change and values is the conversation the boards have. And that's what's going to preserve programming and excellence. I mean, why would you do this if you were going to give up what had worked and what might work better? There would be no sense to even beginning a conversation if you both didn't recognize that each institution offered something special, was solving a problem, and had an approach to solving the problem. There are unnatural fits, and so that should become evident when two boards sit down with each other. But there are many natural fits, and that becomes evidence because the theory of change conversation, what is the end result and how do you get there? That, you know, being a short-term definition of theory of change, and the core values. And this, by the way, I've seen a couple of questions on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And in the new board, if it's a merger and you're having a new board, core values best define and include the diversity, equity, and inclusion as a core value and as part of the mission. You cannot operate in today's market without valuing diversity, inclusion, and equity. And so any smart group of people is going to recognize that today and say that has to be central to what we're going to do next and complement where we've been excellent.
And you know, that question kind of assumes that they do have quality programs and that they're the best of the kind. And really, you know, you have to be open to the fact that maybe they aren't, or that at least you can improve upon them given the resources and the ideas the other group is bringing in, whether it's a merger or some other kind of collaboration. None of us are going to be perfect. You need to be open to that, to those changes.
Yeah, I want to shift us barely only slightly towards going deeper into this question about are we losing culture? Are we gaining culture? Merging philosophy, and maybe we'll save identity for the next moment, but I'm sure that's going to come up. That's wrapped into our sense. What is that? You know, how do you think about merging cultures and philosophies within an organization?
Well, I'll say one thing that I've done with clients. We didn't have this tool when we did our merger, and I think we just sort of got in and started to talk to each other. We didn't have a special way, but I was able to develop a cultural assessment tool, and with a couple of my clients, the staff, these were not huge organizations, although one was a Habitat for Humanity. The staff filled out a survey it was like a Myers-Briggs for your organization. And the questions were, how are you? You know, what do you experience? And the second set was, what do you want? What would you like to have? Again, thinking about what do we want to create together and the opportunity to do that. So then we were able to take the results of that back to staff and say, this group A, these are your strong characteristics. Group B, these are your strong characteristics from an organizational culture perspective. And this is what you want to create together. And you could really look visually at, are we very far apart? And actually they weren't. But it again is that the opportunity to create new, not just mush together what is. So
yeah, I like that. I love that answer. I'll add to that by saying, you know, I think while mission, I think of organizations' missions, that's your guiding star of where you're going. Your vision, and I'm a big believer, you can rewrite your vision whenever it suits you, but the vision is a tool for the how you're going to get there. It's your guiding star of how. Knowing what success looks like will answer a lot of those questions about how do you get to a new culture, whether or not you've got some culture that you don't really like that you're trying to improve, or some culture that you want to have more of as you're coming together. And that's true whether or not you're merging or staying the same. But I think it's relatively easy if you have a clear vision to come to alignment around how you agree to do things together from a cultural
Now, Sarah, I might say a word here that might be toxic or or controversial in something like this, but marketing. You know, so much of this is internal marketing. And not to say you're selling anybody anything that they don't need or shouldn't have, or, you know, we're not talking Joe Azuzu snake oil here. But what we are talking about is being able to positively and truthfully represent what is going on, so that people are open to the possibility of whatever it is you're trying to accomplish. And because people learn different ways, they hear different ways, and because I've seen some one merger in particular really comes to mind that should have happened, and it simply was not marketed well among the people who it should have been, and they paid dearly for years, both organizations, for not doing it.
Great point. And marketing is not a bad word, folks. Marketing is finding and engaging people so they take action, whether
Yes.
they're your employees or your donors or the people you're serving. And if that doesn't sum up what every nonprofit I've ever met is all about, I don't know what is. So marketing and nonprofits should be like, you know, happy lovebirds together.
Amen.
Yeah, and this is a real opportunity. One of the key threads, you know, when you're negotiating, you want to be looking for whoever you're working with is to make sure you're doing, there's a lot of simultaneous things, due diligence, you know, the staffing, pattern negotiation, all that stuff. Communication planning. Don't forget, you want to plan your communication. You need to be purposeful about who is the audience, including your staff, who is the audience, what's the message, what's the timing of when we're delivering this, and who's delivering it. And that starts in day one of your negotiations, actually, because you know there are people out there. You think staff don't know what's going on? They do.
Mary, Sarah, it looks like you need to echo yourself, or maybe roll it back to repeat that definition.
Marketing, I see that. Marketing is about finding and engaging people to the point that they take action with you. It's about finding and engaging people to the point that they take action with you.
Now, Phil Kotler offered a slightly different version of that, which was just a simple identifying and satisfying needs. So I don't know about the taking action with you, but I presume that once you've identified something that someone wants or needs, they will acquire it from you. So
yes, there are many definitions of marketing.
Well, Phil's the sort of father of modern day marketing, so that's why I raised his name.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit. Actually, you know, we have some questions. I want to do like a little rapid fire, make sure we've gotten these. Can you comment on fiscal sponsorship for less than $1 million orgs and the cost of governance compliance are high and getting higher? I'm not sure what that's referring to, but maybe somebody can shed light on that, fiscal sponsorship.
I think it's a great opportunity. Go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, I do a lot of work in fiscal sponsorship, and I'm a huge proponent of fiscal sponsorship, particularly when it's structured well and thoughtfully. And I don't know that it always needs to be organizations that are under a certain budget threshold. I've worked with a number of organizations, a number of clients that have maintained and stayed in that fiscally sponsored status indefinitely and don't have plans to separate or exit. I think particularly in the climate that we're in right now, which is, you know, we're going to see consolidation for organizations that are starting up or organizations that have limited capacity, limited bandwidth. Fiscal sponsorship makes a lot of sense. And for those on the call who may not be familiar with it, fiscal sponsorship is a contractual relationship between an organization that has 501c3 status and an entity that doesn't have 501c3 status, that allows the project, the entity without the status, to essentially use their nonprofit status to operate their program, their project, and attract supporters.
It's kind of the ultimate shared services model.
Yeah.
Um,
Socialgoodfund.org is a fiscal sponsor. I just recently interviewed, I have a podcast too, by the way, Inspired Nonprofit Leadership. I haven't released his episode, but he talks all about fiscal sponsorship. They do it and how they do it and why they do it. And so you might want to watch for that.
Yeah, I
coming
want to
up.
say there's a directory someplace, because I know like here in
Fiscal sponsor
Philadelphia,
directory.
Oh, great.
there are others around the country.
I'm going to move us on to another kind of quick question. What needs to be taken into consideration for cross-state mergers, acquisitions, partners?
For what? Say that again. The
Yeah.
Across
Organizations of
state.
different states.
oh,
Yeah.
cross state. Oh, shit. There you go. That was my answer.
I'll take.
I think we pitched that to the attorney.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, if we're talking about merger, and that's really where this becomes an issue, is you're going to have to identify the state of incorporation of the surviving entity. So if we are going to merge two entities into one, that one entity needs to reside in a particular state, because even though we think of nonprofits as creatures of federal, the federal tax code, they're essentially creatures of state law.
Yeah.
So they have to reside in a particular state. And then along with that will come, additional HR questions around, the benefits and status of your employees, as well as the states in which you're going to be fundraising in and may need to register for charitable solicitation.
So Delaware, that's where we want them to go?
No, I don't think it matters so much anymore.
Well, I know you don't have to register for fundraising in Delaware, but besides that, but that doesn't mean you don't register in the states.
Every place else,
money.
Yeah.
Mary, we have a couple people asking for your assessment tool. Is that something we can email a link out to everybody who registers?
I did respond. I'll do the reference that I based it on. I don't have it. It's sort of adapted. I create it with the clients that I'm working with. So it's not a thing. I should probably create it, but it's not a thing that I can just give people. But I'm happy to give you the reference on organizational culture that I use and reference when I do use it. So I'm assuming we're going to have some way of people are asking about contact information, stuff like that. We can do that at the end or send it out with the replay that I think you're going to send everybody, Sarah. So people don't have to lose things. If you want something, ask for it and we'll address it later.
Excellent. Should donors start to encourage mergers? And I'll just start by saying, locally where I am, one of the foundations actually has a grant specifically to help pay for mergers and strategic alliances. So I know that might not be super common. I don't know. I'm wondering, has anybody else seen these kinds of resources?
Community foundations I'm seeing are doing it. I do fear it a little because I find it a little like social engineering by foundations, and they've been saying, oh, we have too many small nonprofits, but they were the ones who gave them the grants to start. And so
they wouldn't say you have too many hardware stores.
Yeah, exactly.
Or
exactly.
Starbucks. Do we have too many Starbucks people?
Never,
Oh
never.
my God.
I think it's a really, the donors are in the seat that the donor has is to give money to what they believe in. And if they don't want to see someone around, don't give money. So I don't think they should be the ones I think they can arrange a date because they think there's something compatible and they really, two groups need to be partners. But donors, foundations in particular, are playing too much in the social engineering world, and I'm offended by that.
Yeah.
Now, what I might suggest, just hit my head now, is having a donor who feels passionate about two organizations introduce their people to each other. Actually, I know, now I'm thinking about it, I know a person who managed foundations who introduced her recipients to each other. And that's good. And if something evolves out of that works, that's super. But that could be a real service to nonprofits, to be a network facilitator.
That dating app.
We've
gonna
had
be
several funding sources, several foundations be willing to fund this. And Mike, to your point, there's a real distinction between promoting and funding. You know, the funding that has been flowing in these more, I would say the last 10 years has been more around organizational effectiveness. It's kind of like getting a strategic planning grant. It's just part of the mix if you have funders who are willing to fund that kind of thing. When we did our merger, nobody funded any of it. And so those are good resources to look for. And I think it's great if they're willing to invest in them, but to Mike's point, promoting is inappropriate.
In any merger discussion I've been a part of, the funders ultimately will play a role in terms of the resources that are needed for the organization.
Yes.
But if they are the driving force behind bringing the two parties together, that's usually a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
So I think we have pretty clear answer on this one. Now here's one that's going to be really hard for a short answer, but let's give it a try. The question is, you mentioned a lot about culture. What happens, or how can you correct right sizing when leadership and the board of directors' view of culture are not in alignment with line staff and lower level management? Well, I'll jump in.
I'm not sure I'm real clear on the question.
Well, if the question is that, like, how do you have two CFOs and how are they both going to keep their jobs? You can't do that. You got to figure something out.
Right.
If you have duplicative services.
Yeah, I think it's a readiness question. It's back to the readiness question. And part of the readiness assessment includes understanding cultures and understanding where the cultures won't mix. And the board should say no way if if staff should have been included in the readiness assessment. So there's a beginning place, right? We don't do an assessment and just ask the board, are you ready to merge? We ask the CEO and all the C-suite and all of the folks below the C-suite and donors and lots of people, right? That it's not a one-stop question. It's multi-players. And so everyone needs to have their voice in the process. And then when that's done, we know what we're facing. I don't go into this without knowing those realities. Then we're not going to have that clash. Or if we have that clash, it was intentional.
But I feel a hint in there of that the board maybe is like business people and the staff doesn't share the same philosophy. And the board is saying, we need to merge and right size. And the staff is saying, this isn't how we work.
My experience with boards and mergers, and I can see where that may happen, Matt, but it's very interesting that board members are more emotional in the process than you would imagine. I have found that it isn't, they are in denial about it because they want to be business-like, and so they may want to drive to structure, but when it comes to something they really care about, because that's why they're there in the first place, they can be the most resistant to change, which is just so interesting to me. This is a personal process. I do think, Mike, I'm not sure what you said earlier, but I don't think the board is as clear about the culture of the organization as the CEO and the staff are. The board is aware of the core values, of course, but this all happens at the staff level. And if line staff are feeling that there's a disconnect between the leadership and the culture, that's a whole other issue.
Yeah,
that's not a merger issue.
Right.
I completely agree with you, Mary. And, I think it is really important that your leadership and your staff are in alignment before you start thinking about working with anybody else. And just to kind of double agree with you, I really agree with Mary that it needs to come from the staff, because when it does, you're most likely to get kind of to the true point, the thing that was already there, and let that bubble up. It's really hard for board members to know and generate the ideas, but usually boards are pretty good at confirming, yes, this makes sense, or no, it doesn't. And also, I've seen boards be emotional in the opposite direction. I can think of 2 boards I know right now where the boards they want the organizations to survive. They're worried about finances, and they're kind of throwing their hands up saying, let's merge, we're scared. And the staff are going, no, we got this, we can do it. And they don't want, and this is a case of like an organizations who are financially unstable. And the staff who have a lot more to lose than the boards are saying, we've got this. And if that's the case, I'd say boards, trust your staff. If they say they've got this, then let them have it and follow their lead for a moment. And you can keep double checking that it makes sense, but don't lose your nerve as a board. It's a scary place to be a board member, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Great. We're just about out of time. We have a few more questions. Well, we have a bunch of smaller questions in here. If anybody wants to take a stab at them, you're welcome to. A couple funding questions. Can you review
So the
role
win
of
for the 501c3 and the financial scholarship is that they'll get a fee for that service over time, whatever that is. So it's an income generator. I imagine, Greg, I don't know, are there other wins out of that besides doing good things?
Yeah, I mean, there are pros for a sponsor. Obviously, they collect a fee from the fiscal sponsorship relationship. Mission fit, it allows them to test drive or pilot innovative ideas that may be in alignment with their mission, potentially attract new donors to the sponsoring organization that the project may bring to bear. So there are pros for the sponsor and certainly pros for the project as well.
There's a question here, looked like consolidation versus merger. What's the difference? Gregory, you can clarify, but I don't think there is any. We talked about corporate consolidation. It's just, I guess the bottom line is, what do you mean by consolidation? And if you're really consolidating, you're probably doing a corporate merger. And one thing that you'll want to explore in your negotiation process is if you each have a common funder, like we both had funding from United Way, you go and ask them and you talk to them at some point in the process. You don't do it right out the gate, but find out, do they have the capacity to keep funding both of you, to maybe give you more? Are they going to reduce it? This is all part of your due diligence when you're figuring out the financial implications for you both, or however many are involved in the merger. It's all, the devil's in the detail some of the times. So.
We have a question I thought I'd touch on about what happens, after the merger. And I want to tie this into that, marketing or another word that I love to use, branding. But, branding and the core of branding is something really special. And it's about understanding who you are as an organization. And I think just like it helps every single organization to really get clear and to be able to write down a few things that sum up who they are and how they choose to exist in the world and why they're there, is just as important. After the merger, you will begin to form a new unified identity. And coming back to some core branding work is really important. And then letting that radiate out into refine. You'll have a bunch of new policies probably in place and people getting to know each other. And you can let that new self-identity radiate out into refining your policies and procedures. How do we hire people according in a way that's very culturally aligned? How do we work with our board? How do we interact with our donors and with our clients? And what do we do with our new resources? And having a really strong sense of self-identity is kind of a really great step, in my opinion, for doing that work and entering a phase of refinement. I think in the kind of natural growth cycle of any organization or business, you try something new and it's like a project about, well, we're just going to try things and get our first stab at doing it. And then you're going to reach a refinement phase where you're like, oh, let's do this even better. Let's, kind of go through it with a fine tooth comb. And then you're going to have some new ideas to try, and then you're going to refine.
Yeah, the marketing can't end. And really, you have to be able to keep people positive about this, particularly the early stages after, because it's not like, okay, your click, it's over, everybody sings Kumbaya and off we go.
Yeah. I just want to point out, there's really, some of David LaPiana's work pointed out there's 3 stages. So as we kind of wrap this up, there's exploration, which is when you're looking around for, is there a partner out there, and you're developing your criteria, you're assessing yourselves and you're assessing partners. There's negotiation when you've decided, I'm going to use a marriage metaphor, that you're getting engaged. You don't negotiate with more than one entity. And you negotiate and you're just engaged. You haven't said yes at the altar yet, folks. So that's when you really are learning a lot about, is this going to be the mission-driven strategy we thought it would? And at the end, which overlaps, is what Sarah was starting to talk about, is integration, implementation planning. When you begin to look at the reality of how are we going to be together? You know, we got our households together. Now, what the heck is that going to look like? And that can take time. It will take time. It's where the culture really emerges. You know, you're going to see things about your culture you didn't even know, but you'll work it out.
And one thing crosses my mind is, don't think that if you're small, the smaller culture can't influence the bigger culture. Because it really.
And don't think if you're big, you're not going to be influenced.
That's right. We have to end. All of the consultants, I'll make sure to send out your information. Please take a moment, Greg, Mike, Mary, and Matt, to send me any resources that you said you would share, and I'll make sure email goes out to everybody who registered. Thank you so much for participating. And if you're watching the replay, please leave a comment and say hi. Thank you, everybody.